Clear on the left.
Clear on the right. Keep it steady as she goes.
My father worked at a Chrysler plant in Detroit during the war. He was 34 years old in December 1941, with a bad knee that kept him out of the draft, and he spent the next 4 years on a factory floor doing work that he described for the rest of his life as the most important thing he ever did, not because he was modest about it. My father was not a modest man, but because he believed it. He had watched the tanks come off the line. He had watched the numbers. He understood, in a way that not everyone who worked those shifts understood, that what was happening on those floors was not just manufacturing. It was a prosecution of a war. It was a mechanism by which a country that had been attacked, that was fighting on two fronts simultaneously against adversaries who had years of preparation and momentum on their side, was going to win. He was right. And the story of how he was right, the story of what American industrial production actually was in the Second World War, what it achieved, what it required, and what it meant, is one of the most consequential stories in modern history. It is a story that begins before Pearl Harbor, that reaches its decisive moments in 1942 and 1943, and that ended the war before the last battle was fought, because the outcome of the war had been determined in the factories before it was determined on the battlefields. The numbers are the place to start, because without the numbers, the story does not make sense. In 1940, the United States produced approximately 331 military aircraft. In 1944, it produced 96,318. In 1940, American shipyards launched roughly 500,000 tons of merchant shipping. In 1943, they launched 19 million tons. In 1940, American factories produced 331 tanks. In 1943, they produced 29,497. These numbers are not just impressive in isolation. They are decisive in context. In the context of what Germany and Japan were producing during the same period, and in the context of what the war actually required to be won. Germany produced approximately 34,000 aircraft over the entire course of the war. The United States produced nearly 300,000. Japan produced roughly 76,000 aircraft total. American production exceeded that figure in 1944 alone. The Soviet Union, which bore the greatest land burden of the war against Germany, received through the Lend-Lease program more than 400,000 American trucks, 14,000 aircraft, and enough food to feed its armies for significant periods when Soviet domestic supply was insufficient. The war against Japan in the Pacific was fought with American ships, American aircraft, and American logistics on a scale that Japan could not approach regardless of the courage or skill of its fighting forces. The transformation that produced these numbers did not happen automatically. It did not happen simply because America was large and rich and industrially capable. It happened because of a series of decisions made under pressure by people who understood what was required and were willing to reorganize the entire American economy to achieve it. And it happened because of millions of individual human beings, my father among them, who showed up for their shifts and did their work and kept doing it for 4 years straight. I want to take a moment here and ask you to subscribe if you haven't already. The stories on this channel exist to tell the full truth about the Second World War, not just the battles and the commanders, but the foundations that made the battles possible, the people whose contributions shaped the outcome without ever appearing in the famous photographs. If that matters to you, subscribe now and share this with someone who should be watching. Back to the factory floors, back to 1941, and the people who understood, before most of the country had absorbed what Pearl Harbor meant, that the war was going to be won or lost in American production facilities. The conversion of the American automobile industry to war production in 1942 was not accomplished by administrative decree alone. It required the active cooperation of the industry's leadership. Men like Charles Wilson at General Motors and Henry Ford II, who took over Ford Motor Company from his aging grandfather in 1945, but whose company had already made its most significant wartime commitments under the elder Ford's reluctant direction. The relationship between the Roosevelt administration and American business during the mobilization was not uncomplicated. Many of the men who ran the major corporations had been hostile to the New Deal, had resisted labor organizing, and had personal and ideological objections to the degree of government direction that wartime mobilization required. Some of them had to be persuaded. Some had to be pressured. Some found in the war emergency a patriotic commitment that overrode their other reservations. The dollar-a-year men were the mechanism through which this accommodation was achieved. These were senior executives from major corporations who came to Washington for the duration of the war to work in the mobilization agencies, the War Production Board, the Office of War Mobilization, the War Manpower Commission, for the nominal salary of $1 per year, the actual compensation coming from their companies. They brought to the government the management skills and the corporate knowledge of specific industries that the government agencies needed but did not have. They also brought, inevitably, the perspectives and the interests of the industries they came from, which created tensions that were never fully resolved but that, in the wartime context, were managed well enough to produce the production results that the war required. The relationship between the War Production Board and the military services was another source of constant tension. The Army and the Navy had their own procurement organizations, their own production priorities, and their own relationships with manufacturers. They were not always willing to subordinate their specific requirements to the broader coordination that the War Production Board was trying to impose. The result was a system that was never as clean or as efficient as the production numbers might suggest, a system of competing priorities, bureaucratic conflicts, and improvised compromises that somehow, despite its messiness, produced output on a scale that no planned economy had ever achieved. The labor dimension of the mobilization was equally complex. The American labor movement in 1941 was not the quiescent partner that management might have preferred. The unions, particularly the CIO, the Congress of Industrial Organizations, which had organized the major industrial workers in the auto, steel, and rubber industries in the late 1930s, had their own priorities, their own leadership, and their own traditions of shop floor militancy that did not disappear simply because the country was at war. The no-strike pledge that union leadership offered at the beginning of the war, a commitment not to use the strike weapon for the duration, was a genuine contribution to the mobilization effort. It was not always honored at the shop floor level, where wildcat strikes over specific grievances continued to occur throughout the war, but it held at the institutional level in ways that kept the major war industries operating without the kind of labor disruption that might have significantly slowed production. The wages that war production workers earned transformed working-class life in America in ways that had lasting consequences. The Depression had driven wages down and kept them down for a decade. War production, with its premium pay for overtime and its full employment, reversed this pattern dramatically. Factory workers who had been living on marginal incomes in the late 1930s found themselves earning wages that allowed them to save money, to pay off debts, to think about the future in ways that poverty had made impossible. The war was creating, in the process of fighting it, the economic conditions that would sustain the post-war prosperity that transformed American life in the 1950s and 1960s. The specific production achievements of individual plants and individual products deserve more attention than the aggregate numbers alone can provide, because the numbers are so large that they lose their meaning. Consider the M4 Sherman tank, the primary American medium tank of the Second World War, which was produced in larger numbers than any other Allied tank. The Sherman was not the best tank of the war. It was inferior to the German Panther and Tiger in armor and firepower in one-on-one engagements. German tank crews who faced Shermans in France and Germany knew this, and they were sometimes surprised by how quickly American units replaced their losses. Where a German division might field 30 operational tanks after heavy fighting and have no immediate prospect of replacement, an American division in the same position might have 50 new Shermans arriving within days. The Sherman's strategic value was not its individual fighting quality, but its availability. It was simple enough to produce in enormous numbers, reliable enough to maintain in field conditions, and versatile enough to be adapted for multiple roles. American industry produced roughly 49,000 Shermans during the war. Britain and the Soviet Union received thousands more under Lend-Lease. Germany produced roughly 1,347 Tigers and 6,000 Panthers combined. The arithmetic of tank production was one of the clearest expressions of production war's asymmetry, and its consequences on the battlefield were direct. Allied armored forces could absorb losses that would have destroyed German armor formations and keep fighting. The P-51 Mustang is another case study in how production quality and quantity combined to produce decisive military effect. The Mustang was the result of a collaboration between North American Aviation, which designed and built it, and Rolls-Royce, which contributed the Merlin engine that transformed it from a mediocre aircraft into the best long-range fighter of the war. The Mustang could score heavy bombers from England to Berlin and back, a range capability that no previous Allied fighter had possessed. Before the Mustang entered service in large numbers in early 1944, American and British bombers flying deep into Germany were unescorted for much of their route, suffering losses to German fighters that were strategically unsustainable. After the Mustang, the German fighter force defending the Reich was ground down in a series of air battles that destroyed its best pilots and broke its ability to protect German production facilities from the bombing campaign. North American Aviation produced roughly 15,686 P-51s during the war. The aircraft was built at two plants, one in Inglewood, California, and one in Dallas, Texas, using assembly line techniques that, like Willow Run, applied automobile production logic to aircraft manufacturing. The quality control that the plants achieved was remarkable given the production rates. Mustangs that came off the line were consistently airworthy and reliable, a tribute to the training programs that North American had developed to bring workers without prior aviation experience up to the standards required for military aircraft production. The story of American production in the Pacific Theater has a specific geography that is worth following, because the Pacific War was, more than any other theater of the Second World War, a war of logistics. The distances involved were enormous. From the west coast of the United States to the Japanese home islands is roughly 5,500 miles, and the chain of islands across which the American advance moved in the final 2 years of the war stretched across that entire distance. Every gallon of aviation fuel, every artillery shell, every ration, every spare part for every aircraft and ship and vehicle that participated in the Pacific Campaign had to travel across those distances from American production facilities to the front. The logistics system that made this possible was built largely from scratch during the war. The Navy's construction battalions, the Seabees, as they were universally known, were the instrument through which the physical infrastructure of the Pacific Campaign was created. The Seabees built airfields on captured islands within days of their being secured by Marine and Army forces. They built harbor facilities, roads, fuel depots, ammunition dumps, and base installations across thousands of miles of ocean. They worked under fire, in tropical heat, on islands that had no infrastructure of any kind, and they produced results that allowed the American advance to maintain its pace. Without the Seabees, the island hopping strategy that brought American forces within range of the Japanese home islands would not have been logistically feasible. The scale of the American naval construction program during the war is another set of numbers that deserve to be considered carefully. The United States Navy in December 1941 was the world's second largest, behind the British Royal Navy. By the end of the war, it was the largest by an enormous margin, larger than all other navies in the world combined. Between 1941 and 1945, American shipyards produced 18 fleet carriers, 9 light carriers, 77 escort carriers, 8 battleships, 48 cruisers, 349 destroyers, 498 destroyer escorts, and 203 submarines, among many other vessel types. The numbers are almost incomprehensible in the context of what naval construction normally requires. The years of design work, the skilled labor, the specialized facilities, the complex supply chains of materials that go into warships. The escort carrier program illustrates a particular kind of industrial creativity. Escort carriers, small, relatively slow carriers built on merchant ship hulls rather than dedicated warship hulls, were a response to the specific problem of providing air cover for convoys in the Atlantic and for amphibious operations in the Pacific, where the large fleet carriers were too valuable and too scarce to commit to every operation. The escort carriers were not impressive warships by conventional measures. They were described by their crews as combustible, vulnerable, and expendable. But they were available in large numbers because they could be built on production lines adapted for merchant shipbuilding, and availability turned out to be more valuable than sophistication in the roles they were assigned. The workers who built the arsenal of democracy came from everywhere and brought everything they had. The story of the American industrial mobilization is, at one level, a story of numbers, the production totals, the conversion timelines, the logistical achievements. At another level, it is a story of individual human beings whose lives were changed, sometimes permanently, by 4 years of wartime production work. The women who entered the industrial workforce in large numbers for the first time during the war years did not all leave it when the war ended. Many of them had experienced, for the first time in their lives, the specific satisfactions of skilled manufacturing work, the physical competence it required, the pride of specific expertise, the social world of the factory floor, the wages that provided an economic independence they had not previously had. Some were pushed out when the returning veterans reclaimed their jobs, as the wartime agreements that had brought women into war industries required. Others stayed, finding their way into the expanded peacetime manufacturing economy on terms that would not have been available to them before the war. The wartime experience of women in industrial production was one of the seeds from which the post-war women's movement eventually grew. Not inevitably, not in a straight line, but in ways that historians of American feminism have recognized as part of the story. The African American workers who came north during the war years established communities in Detroit and Chicago and Pittsburgh and the other industrial cities that became permanent features of American urban life. The Great Migration had been underway before the war, but the war accelerated it dramatically. Between 1940 and 1945, roughly 700,000 African Americans moved from the South to the cities of the North and Midwest, following the war production jobs. They came expecting better wages and better opportunities, and in many cases they found them. They also found discrimination in housing, in some workplaces, in the social institutions of the cities they moved to. The wartime tension between the democratic rhetoric of the war America was fighting and racial inequality it was practicing at home generated pressures that did not resolve until decades after the war ended, in the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s. The physical plants where the war was built are part of the story too. The buildings and the facilities and the landscapes that the mobilization created, and that are still, in some cases, visible in the American industrial geography. The Willow Run plant in Michigan still stands, largely repurposed but recognizable. A vast shed of reinforced concrete and steel that covers more than 3 million square feet of floor space. Its history is preserved in the work of historians and the memories of the workers who built the B-24s there, and in the occasional tour groups who walk through it and try to imagine what it looked like in 1944, when it was producing a bomber every 63 minutes. The Kaiser shipyards in Richmond, California, are largely gone, the physical facilities dismantled, and the land repurposed in the decades after the war. But the community that grew around them during the war is still there, transformed but continuous, a city shaped by the wartime influx of workers who came from across America to build the Liberty ships. Richmond's population tripled during the war years. African American workers, who came in significant numbers from the South, established neighborhoods and institutions that became the foundation of Richmond's African American community for generations afterward. The wartime production facility is gone. The community it created remains. The B-17 Flying Fortress, produced at the Boeing plant in Seattle, Washington, is another specific story worth telling. The B-17 was the primary American heavy bomber in the European theater for most of the war. The aircraft that flew the daylight precision bombing campaign against German industrial targets from 1942 through 1944. The Boeing plant in Seattle had been producing the B-17 in small numbers before the war, and the expansion production of wartime levels required both the enlargement of the existing plant and the creation of new facilities in Wichita, Kansas, and at a plant in Burbank, California, operated by Lockheed's Vega division. The men and women who built B-17s, who assembled the thousands of precision parts that went into each aircraft, who installed the engines and the gun turrets and the bombing equipment and the radio systems, understood something specific about what they were making. The B-17 was not a commodity. It was a fighting machine that would carry a 10-man crew into the most dangerous airspace in the world, over heavily defended German cities, on missions from which many aircraft did not return. The people who built it knew this. The families of the crew members who flew it knew this. The connection between the factory floor and the combat theater was direct and understood in both directions. The Norden bomb site, which was supposed to allow American bombers to achieve the precision accuracy that the daylight bombing doctrine required, was produced in a New York factory and delivered to the 8th Air Force with a security classification that treated it as one of the most sensitive military technologies of the war. The bombers carried instructions to destroy the bomb site rather than allow it to fall into enemy hands if an aircraft went down. In practice, the precision that the Nord was supposed to achieve was regularly defeated by weather, by combat damage to the aircraft, and by the psychological conditions of combat. Men under fire do not always perform at the level that instruments designed for calm conditions require. The daylight precision bombing campaign was less precise than its planners had intended, but it was conducted at a scale, thousands of sorties per week, hundreds of tons of bombs per target. That compensated for the precision shortfall with sheer mass. The production of ammunition, the artillery shells, the bombs, the bullets, the mortar rounds, the naval ordnance, was itself a massive industrial undertaking that required a chain of facilities stretching from the mines where the raw materials were extracted to the loading plants where the finished ordnance was assembled. The Twin Cities Ordnance Plant in Arden Hills, Minnesota, the Joliet Arsenal in Illinois, the Kansas Army Ammunition Plant. These were facilities that employed tens of thousands of workers, many of them women, in work that was physically demanding, chemically hazardous, and absolutely essential to the military campaign. The workers who handled explosives and propellants in these plants did their work in conditions that were carefully monitored for safety, but that were never entirely safe. In a way that working with explosives is never entirely safe. Some of them were injured. Some were killed in accidents. All of them understood the risk, and they kept working. The relationship between the strategic bombing campaign and American industrial production created a particular kind of feedback loop that is worth examining. The bombers at American factories produced were flying to Germany to bomb German factories. The German factories were trying to produce the aircraft that would shoot down the American bombers. The American factories needed to produce bombers faster than they were being shot down. The German factories needed to produce fighters faster than they were being destroyed in the air and on the ground. This was a production war in its most concentrated form, a race between two industrial systems, conducted not just in the factories but in the skies above them, with the destruction of the enemy's productive capacity being both the means and the objective. The strategic bombing campaign, whatever its limitations in achieving precise destruction of specific industrial targets, contributed to the German production crisis in ways that the post-war bombing survey documented. German production of certain key materials, synthetic oil in particular, which was a fuel on which the German military ran, was severely reduced by the bombing in 1944 and early 1945. German fighter production, paradoxically, increased during the bombing campaign as the dispersal production facilities made the industry harder to destroy. But the trained pilots to fly the fighters were being killed faster than they could be replaced, because the fighter production that kept the German Air Force equipped could not replace the human capital that the air battles were consuming. The men who flew the American bombers over Germany, the crews of the B-17s and B-24s and B-29s, the fighter pilots who protected them, the navigators and bombardiers and gunners who kept the formations flying and fighting, were the human end of the production chain. They took the aircraft that the factories built and used them in a way the strategy required. Many of them died doing it. The 8th Air Force, which conducted the daylight bombing campaign from England, sustained casualty rates that exceeded those of the American infantry in some periods of the war. The men who flew the early missions over Germany before the P-51 Mustang was available for long-range escort did. So knowing that the statistical probability of completing a 25-mission tour was less than 1 in 3, the connection between those men in the sky over Germany and my father on the factory floor in Detroit was direct and understood by both. The aircraft that the factory built was the aircraft that the crew flew. The crew's survival depended in part on the quality of the aircraft, on whether the rivets held and the engines ran, and the instruments functioned and the oxygen system worked at 25,000 feet over Frankfurt or Schweinfurt or Regensburg. The workers on the floor understood this. They built accordingly. The quality metrics for American military aircraft production during the war were, by any historical standard, remarkable, not just in the numbers produced, but in the reliability of the individual aircraft, which was a direct function of the care and skill with which they were assembled. This is what my father meant when he said it was the most important thing he ever did, not the numbers in the abstract, the specific thing he made at a specific station that went somewhere specific and did something specific that mattered. The production numbers are the aggregate of millions of specific acts of skill and care and commitment, performed by millions of people who understood, or who came to understand, over the course of 4 years of war, that what they were doing was part of something larger than any one of them could see from where they stood. The war ended, the production lines converted, the workers went home, and the world that emerged from the war, the world of the Marshall Plan and the United Nations and the long peace of the Cold War's nuclear balance, was built on the foundation of what those factories had produced, not just the weapons and the ships and the aircraft, the demonstrated capacity, the knowledge that this country, when it committed to something, could do it at a scale and a speed that no adversary could match and no ally could fully anticipate. That knowledge shaped everything that came after. The specific experience of working in a war production facility in America during the Second World War varied enormously depending on where you were, what you were making, and who you were. The range of experience encompassed everything from the relatively comfortable conditions of an established automobile plant that had converted to war production, with union contracts and established safety procedures, to the improvised conditions of a new facility built on an empty field, staffed by workers who had never done manufacturing work before, operating under the pressure of production schedules that allowed no time for the gradual refinement of procedures that peacetime production would have permitted. The pace was relentless in ways that are difficult to convey to people who have not worked in high-volume manufacturing. The assembly line does not stop because a worker is tired. It does not stop because a machinery needs adjustment, or because a part is slightly out of specification, or because a procedure needs to be reconsidered. The pressure to maintain pace, to keep up with the line, to make the production quota, to send the aircraft or the tank or the ship out the door on schedule, was constant and intense. Workers who couldn't maintain the pace were replaced. Workers who could maintain it did so at a physical cost that wore on bodies and minds over years of sustained effort. The health consequences of wartime production work were real, and they were not always acknowledged in the wartime context, where the priority was production rather than worker welfare. The chemical exposures in the ammunition plants and the aircraft painting facilities and the metal finishing operations created long-term health problems that many workers carried with them into their post-war lives without ever fully understanding the connection between their work and their illness. The repetitive stress injuries that come from years of performing the same motion thousands of times per shift produce physical damage that declared itself decades later. The hearing loss from sustained exposure to factory noise was cumulative and permanent. These costs were not counted in production totals, and they were not, for the most part, compensated. The wartime housing situation in production cities was another dimension of the mobilization that the production numbers do not capture. The rapid influx of workers into cities like Detroit, Richmond, and Seattle created housing crises that the local infrastructure could not accommodate. Workers lived in converted garages, in trailer camps, in rooming houses where multiple people shared a bed in shifts. The term hot bunking, borrowed from naval practice, described a reality in which a bed was never cold because someone was always sleeping in it. Families were split across multiple locations as workers followed the jobs to cities where they had no established housing and no social networks. The federal government's response to the housing crisis was to fund the construction of what were called war housing projects, development of standardized small houses and apartment buildings built at speed to accommodate the influx of workers. These projects were not luxurious, but they were serviceable, and they provided the basic shelter that the production workforce required. Many of them became, after the war, the nucleus of suburban communities that grew up around the industrial facilities they'd been built to serve. Some still exist, preserved in the landscape of American industrial cities, as physical evidence of the speed and scale of the wartime mobilization. The child care situation for working mothers was addressed, partially and imperfectly, through a program that established federally funded daycare centers at or near major war production facilities. The Lanham Act of 1940, adapted during the war to support the child care needs of working parents, funded more than 3,000 centers that at their peak served more than 130,000 children. This was insufficient for the need. The number of women who needed child care in order to work in war industries far exceeded the capacity of the federal program. But it was a significant and unprecedented intervention by the federal government into an area of social provision that had not previously been considered a federal responsibility. The post-war dismantling of the Lanham Act child care centers, which occurred rapidly after the war's end as the political priorities shifted to encouraging women to leave the workforce, was experienced by many working mothers as an abrupt withdrawal of support they had come to depend on. The specific mathematics of what American production meant for the outcome of the war can be approached from multiple angles, each of which illuminates a different dimension of the same underlying truth. Consider the Pacific Theater in the final year of the war. By 1944 and 1945, American industrial production had equipped the Pacific Fleet with a carrier force that was simply beyond anything Japan could match or oppose. The fast carrier task forces that conducted the final campaigns in the Pacific, striking targets across Japan, suppressing the remnants of Japanese air power, supporting the amphibious landings that brought American forces within range of the Japanese home islands, operated with freedom of action that was the direct product of production asymmetry. They could afford to fight. They could afford to lose aircraft in combat operations and replace them. They could afford to take damage and repair it. The Japanese carriers and the Japanese air groups, by contrast, were being consumed without replacement, their capability declining in each engagement toward a point of zero effectiveness. The firebombing campaign against Japanese cities that began in March 1945, the campaign of incendiary attacks against Japanese urban areas conducted by B-29 superfortresses flying from the Mariana Islands, was possible only because American production had provided both the aircraft and the bases from which they operated. The B-29 was the most technologically advanced bomber of the war, a product of years of development and enormous production investment. The Mariana Islands from which the B-29s flew had been captured in a costly amphibious campaign in the summer of 1944. The airfields from which they operated had been built by CB construction battalions in weeks. The entire enterprise, from the design of the aircraft to the bases in the Pacific, was a production achievement before it was a military one. The atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945 are generally discussed in terms of their diplomatic and humanitarian consequences. The decision to use them, the casualties they caused, the debate about whether they were necessary to end the war. What is less often discussed is that they were production achievements. The Manhattan Project, which developed them, was the largest and most expensive government-sponsored research and development program in American history to that point, an enterprise that employed more than 130,000 people at facilities across the country, from the uranium enrichment plants at Oak Ridge, Tennessee, to the plutonium production reactors at Hanford, Washington, to the weapons design laboratory at Los Alamos, New Mexico. The atomic bomb was, among other things, a product of American industrial capacity and organizational competence, the ability to build and operate simultaneously and in secret facilities at the cutting edge of scientific knowledge at an industrial scale. The Manhattan Project is, in some ways, the ultimate expression of the American approach to the Second World War. The problem is defined, the resources are mobilized, the people are found, the facilities are built, the production begins. The scale is whatever the problem requires. The timeline is however fast is necessary. The outcome is what the problem demands. My father did not know about the Manhattan Project. Almost nobody did. He knew about what was happening on his factory floor and the floors of the plants around his. He knew about the production quotas and the shift schedules and the specific work that his station required. He knew that the thing he was making was going somewhere that mattered. He showed up. He did the work. He came home. And when the war was over and the numbers were counted and the full scope of what American industry had achieved became part of the public record, he understood that he had been part of it, that the specific thing he had done at his specific station had been one of the millions of acts production from which the arsenal of democracy had been assembled, and that the arsenal of democracy had been decisive. That is the production story of the Second World War. Not a miracle, not an accident, a choice made and remade every day by millions of people to do what was required with everything that was available for as long as it took. The factories won the war before the last battle was fought. My father was there. He knew. The Japanese response to American production provides the clearest measure of how decisive the production asymmetry was. Japanese military and industrial planners understood, in general terms, that the American industrial base was larger than their own. What they did not adequately appreciate, in the strategic calculations that led to the decision to attack Pearl Harbor, was by how much it was larger and how quickly it could be mobilized. The Japanese planning assumed that American productive capacity would take years to convert to military purposes, years during which Japan could consolidate its territorial gains and establish a defensive perimeter that the Americans would find too costly to breach. This assumption was wrong by approximately 2 years. American conversion to war production was essentially complete by the end of 1942, and American output was reaching decisive levels by 1943. By the time Japanese planners fully understood the production gap they were facing, it was too late to close it. Japan's industrial base was not capable of matching American output, even if it had not been under attack by American submarines and aircraft. The raw material constraints, the dependence on imported oil, iron, or rubber, and other materials from the territories Japan had conquered, materials that American submarines were increasingly interdicting, meant that Japanese production was operating with a ceiling that American production was not. Japan could not produce its way out of the strategic situation it was in, because the resources required to increase production were the same resources that the war was consuming and the American interdiction campaign was denying. The American production miracle of the Second World War was not, in the end, a miracle at all. It was a result of deliberate choices, sustained effort, genuine sacrifice, and the mobilization of human talent and energy on a scale that the American economy had never previously attempted. It was a result of my father and millions of people like him showing up for their shifts and doing their work. It was a result of the Rosie, the Riveters, and the Seabees, and the Dollar-a-Year Men, and the union leaders who took the no-strike pledge, and the engineers who figure out how to put a bomber together in 63 minutes. It was a result of a country that discovered, in the emergency of total war, that it was capable of things it had not previously believed possible. The war ended in 1945 with the production line still running at rates that the world had never seen before and has not seen since in the same configuration. The factories that had built the arsenal of democracy converted back, with varying speed and ease, to the production of consumer goods, cars and refrigerators and washing machines, and all the apparatus of the peacetime prosperity that the war's end made possible. The workers went home, or stayed at their machines, or found new jobs in the expanding civilian economy. The equipment was surplus and sold and scrapped. The production records were filed away. And the numbers, the 300,000 aircraft, the 2,700 Liberty ships, the 49,000 Sherman tanks, the 18 fleet carriers, became historical facts rather than ongoing achievements, the measure of something that had been done and could not quite be believed even by the people who had done it. My father believed it. He had been there. He had watched the numbers accumulate. He knew what they meant. And when he said it was the most important thing he ever did, he was right in a way that the strategy books and the battle histories and the generals' memoirs do not always capture. The war was won in the factories by the people on the floors before the last battle was fought. The fighting mattered enormously. The courage mattered. The strategy mattered. But the foundation on which all of it rested was built by the men and women who showed up for their shifts in Detroit and Willow Run and Richmond and 1,000 other places, and made what needed to be made, in the numbers that needed to be made, in the time that was available to make it. They won the war before it was over, and the world that came after is the world they built. The man most associated with the mobilization of American industrial capacity for the war is Donald Nelson, who was appointed chairman of the War Production Board in January 1942 and tasked with coordinating the conversion of the American economy from peacetime to wartime production. Nelson was not a military man. He was a former Sears executive, a retail merchant who had spent a career thinking about supply chains and production scheduling and the logistics of moving goods from factories to consumers at scale. These turned out to be exactly the skills the job required. Nelson's challenge was immense. The American economy in 1941 was still partly in the grip of the Depression's legacy, underemployed, underutilized, with significant productive capacity sitting idle or operating below its potential. Converting that capacity to wartime use required not just turning it on, but redirecting it, persuading, and in many cases compelling, manufacturers to stop making the things they normally made and start making what the war needed. The automobile industry, which in 1941 was the largest manufacturing sector in the American economy, converted almost entirely to war production. General Motors, Ford, Chrysler, companies that had spent decades building cars, began building aircraft engines, tanks, trucks, jeeps, and artillery. The conversion was not smooth. It was not painless, but it was accomplished, and the speed with which it was accomplished was itself remarkable. The automobile industry's conversion illustrates the scale of what was being attempted. At the peak of peacetime production, American automakers were producing roughly 4 million vehicles per year, cars, trucks, commercial vehicles of all kinds. By early 1942, civilian automobile production had essentially ceased. The factories that had been making Buicks and Chevrolets were being retooled for military production. Machine tools were being repositioned. Assembly lines were being redesigned. Workers who had been installing car upholstery were learning to rivet aircraft fuselages. The transition required the cooperation of management, labor, and government in a degree of coordination that American capitalism had never previously attempted. It worked because of something that is easy to underestimate in retrospect: the genuine commitment of the American workforce to the war effort. The men and women who showed up on those factory floors in 1942 and 1943 were not simply doing their jobs. They understood, many of them viscerally, because they had brothers or sons or husbands in the military, that what they were making was going to the people they loved in the places where the fighting was happening. The aircraft that came off the Ford Willow Run assembly line was going to fly in the Pacific or over Germany. The tank that came out of the Chrysler plant was going to carry American soldiers across France. This knowledge was not abstract. It shaped the quality and the intensity of the work in ways that were not captured in any production metric. The Willow Run plant deserves specific attention because it represents, as well as any single facility, what the American industrial mobilization actually was. The plant was built by Ford Motor Company on farmland outside of Ypsilanti, Michigan, beginning in 1941. It was designed from the outset to mass-produce the consolidated B-24 Liberator bomber, using the same assembly line techniques that Ford had developed for automobile production. At the time it was conceived, this idea was considered somewhere between optimistic and delusional. Aircraft were not cars. They were enormously complex machines with thousands of precision components, assembled by skilled craftsmen over weeks or months, not rolling off a line every few minutes. The idea that a factory designed along automobile assembly principles could produce bombers at automobile production rates struck many aviation professionals as simply impossible. It was not impossible. By the spring of 1944, Willow Run was producing one B-24 bomber every 63 minutes. One complete, flyable, fully equipped heavy bomber, a machine with more than 1 million components, requiring more than 100,000 hours of skilled labor to build in conventional production. Every 63 minutes, around the clock, 7 days a week. Over its production life, Willow Run produced more than 8,600 B-24s, which represented roughly a quarter of all the B-24s ever built. The plant employed at its peak more than 42,000 workers, the majority of them people who had no prior manufacturing experience and who had been trained for their specific jobs in weeks rather than years. The transformation of American women's role in the workforce during the war years is inseparable from the story of industrial production. The phrase Rosie the Riveter has become a cultural shorthand for this transformation, but the shorthand understates the reality. By 1944, women constituted roughly 36% of the civilian workforce in war industries, not as auxiliaries or support workers, but as production workers, doing the same jobs that men had done before the war, operating the same machines, meeting the same production quotas. Many of them had never worked in manufacturing before. They learned, and the learning curve was steep enough that by the middle of the war, the productivity metrics for women workers in several industries matched or exceeded those for male workers doing the same jobs. The expansion of the workforce drew on populations that had been excluded from industrial employment before the war. African Americans, who had faced systematic discrimination in hiring at most major manufacturing facilities in the pre-war period, were brought into war production in large numbers, partly through the requirements of federal contracts, which beginning in 1941 included provisions prohibiting racial discrimination in war industries, and partly through the sheer force of labor demand. The Great Migration of African Americans from the South to the industrial cities of the North and Midwest accelerated dramatically during the war years, as workers followed the jobs to Detroit and Chicago and Pittsburgh and the shipyards of the Pacific Coast. The Kaiser shipyards on the Pacific Coast represent a different kind of industrial miracle, one that was accomplished not through conversion of existing facilities, but through the creation of entirely new ones, built from scratch, staffed by workers with no shipbuilding experience, operating on production principles that the established shipbuilding industry had dismissed as impractical. Henry Kaiser was not a shipbuilder. He was a construction contractor who had built the Hoover Dam and the Bay Bridge and several other large civil engineering projects. He knew how to organize large workforces, manage complex supply chains, and meet deadlines on projects that conventional wisdom said couldn't be done on a proposed schedule. Kaiser applied construction contractor logic to ship production. He built Liberty ships, cargo vessels of standardized design, intended to carry war supplies across the Atlantic and Pacific, using prefabrication techniques borrowed from construction, instead of building a ship in place, as traditional shipbuilding methods required. Kaiser's yards fabricated sections of the hull and superstructure in separate facilities, and then assembled them at the slipway. The sections were standardized enough that they could be produced in large quantities and assembled in sequence, reducing the time from keel laying to launch from months to weeks. At the peak of production, a Kaiser yard could launch a completed Liberty ship in fewer than 5 days from the moment construction began. The record, set at the Richmond, California yard in November 1942 in a deliberately staged demonstration of what was possible, was 4 days, 15 hours, and 26 minutes. The Liberty ships are, in aggregate, one of the most significant military assets of the Second World War. More than 2,700 were built between 1941 and 1945. They carried material of the Allied war effort, food, fuel, ammunition, vehicles, aircraft, across every ocean to every theater of the war. They were not beautiful ships. They were not sophisticated ships. They were utilitarian to the point of crudeness, designed to be built fast and sail in convoy and deliver their cargo and be replaced if they were sunk. They were designed to be expendable, and the fact that they could be produced in such numbers and replaced so quickly when they were lost to U-boat attack was one of the reasons the Battle of the Atlantic eventually turned in the Allies' favor. German submarines were sinking Allied shipping faster than it could be replaced in 1942. By 1943, American production had reversed that equation. The ships were being built faster than they could be sunk. The story of American production in the Second World War is also a story about logistics, about the movement of the material from where it was produced to where it was needed, across oceans and continents, on a scale and at a speed that had no precedent in military history. The logistics of supplying the Allied forces in Western Europe after the Normandy landings, the fuel, the ammunition, the food, the replacement equipment, the medical supplies, were managed by an organization called the Red Ball Express, which operated a continuous convoy system on dedicated highway routes from the Normandy beaches to the front lines of the Allied advance. At its peak, the Red Ball Express was running 140 truck companies, moving an average of 12,500 tons of supplies per day across routes that stretched hundreds of miles. The trucks that ran the Red Ball Express were American. The fuel that powered them was American. The organization that managed them was American. And the African-American soldiers who drove a disproportionate share of those trucks, who worked the overnight shifts on dangerous roads, who kept the convoys moving through rain and darkness and German air attack, were doing work that the official history of the war took decades to adequately acknowledge. The question of what the American industrial mobilization actually decided is one that historians have examined carefully, and the answer is not simple. The war was not won by production alone. It was won by the fighting quality of Allied soldiers and sailors and airmen, by the strategic decisions of Allied commanders, by the resistance movements in occupied countries, by the particular courage of specific individuals in specific moments. Production created the conditions within which all of these human contributions could be decisive. It provided a material foundation without which no amount of courage or skill or strategic insight could prevail against adversaries who had been preparing for war for a decade. What American production specifically contributed was the elimination of one of the most fundamental constraints of military power: scarcity. The Allied forces, from roughly the middle of 1943 onward, were not constrained by shortage of equipment or ammunition or supplies in the way that their German and Japanese adversaries increasingly were. They could absorb losses of ships, of aircraft, of vehicles that would have been strategically crippling for any other combatant in the war. They could replace lost equipment faster than the enemy could destroy it. They could sustain offensives for longer periods at greater intensity over wider fronts than any previous army in history had been able to do, because the logistical support behind those offensives was operating at a scale that made sustained offensive power possible. Germany's production situation by 1944 was, by contrast, one of progressive scarcity. The Allied strategic bombing campaign, conducted by the aircraft produced in vast numbers by American factories, was systematically reducing Germany's ability to produce the fuel, the steel, the aircraft engines, the rolling stock, and the military equipment that the German war effort required. Every German fighter produced consumed aluminum, skilled labor, and manufacturing capacity that was not being used to produce something else. Every plant that was bombed had to be rebuilt with resources that were increasingly scarce. The arithmetic of production war was moving inexorably in one direction by 1943 and 1944, and that direction was not toward Germany. Japan's situation was, if anything, more extreme. Japan had entered the war with an industrial base that was a fraction of America's in almost every relevant metric. It had calculated, in making the decision to attack Pearl Harbor, that a quick, decisive blow could create conditions in which the United States would negotiate a settlement rather than fight a prolonged war of attrition. The calculation was not irrational given Japanese assumptions. It was catastrophically wrong given American reality. The American economy, once mobilized, produced war material at rates that Japanese strategists had not fully credited and could not match. By 1944, Japan was losing production war in the Pacific as decisively as it was losing the military war. Its merchant fleet, the lifeline that connected Japan's home islands to the resources of the territories it conquered, was being destroyed by American submarines at rates that Japanese shipbuilding could not replace. Its aircraft production, though it increased during the war, never approached American production levels, and the quality of its aviators was declining as the experienced pilots killed at Midway and in the subsequent campaigns were replaced by men with less training and less experience. The material foundation of Japanese military power was eroding steadily, and the cause was primarily American production. My father understood this. He understood it from the factory floor, from the daily experience of watching the output accumulate, of knowing that what his plant was producing was part of a larger equation that was going to resolve in one direction, because it could not resolve in any other. He was not a strategist. He was not a historian. He was a man with a bad knee who showed up for his shift and made his contribution, but he had the kind of practical intelligence that factory work develops, the ability to understand a complex system by working in it, to see the whole in the parts, to know what the output means because you have seen it accumulate day by day over 4 years. The America that emerged from the Second World War was different from the America that entered it, partly because of what the industrial mobilization had revealed about what the country was capable of. The scale of what had been accomplished, the numbers, the speed, the quality, the coordination, had demonstrated something about American productive capacity that the Depression years had obscured. The country could do enormous things when it committed to doing them. It had done enormous things. The factories had done it. The workers had done it. My father had done it. He retired from Chrysler in 1972 after 31 years and went home to his garden and his grandchildren. He died in 1989. He never talked about the war in abstract terms, never talked about strategy or geopolitics or the significance of what American production had meant for the Allied victory. He talked about the plant, about the shifts, about the people he had worked with, about the specific thing he had done at a specific station, on his specific machine, day after day for 4 years. The particular and the concrete were where he lived. But when he said it was the most important thing he ever did, he understood why it was important. He understood the numbers. He had watched them accumulate. He knew what they meant. The particular genius of the American industrial mobilization, if genius is the right word for something that was also grinding and painful and imperfect in 100 ways, was the combination of scale with speed. Other industrial economies had produced war material at large scales before. The question was how quickly the production could be ramped up and how quickly losses could be replaced once the fighting began. The answer the American economy gave to that question was unlike anything the world had previously seen. Aircraft lost in the morning raids over Germany could be replaced with new aircraft arriving from American factories within weeks. Ships sunk by submarine attack in the Atlantic could be replaced with ships launched from Kaiser's yards within days. The tempo of replacement exceeded the tempo of destruction in every major category of war material by 1943, and the gap widened steadily through 1944 and into 1945. The adversaries who had been trying to destroy American military power faster than it could be rebuilt eventually found themselves in a position that could not be sustained. They were losing faster than they could replace their losses, while the Americans were replacing their losses faster than they could be destroyed. That is a production war in its simplest formulation. That is why it ended the way it did.